Good afternoon. My name is Alexandra Barraza. I am the president of HighScope Educational Research Foundation. Welcome to our fifth roundtable, Measure What Matters, Anchoring Assessment, Evaluation, and Research to Equity, a discussion on research and practice, and it is part of the Don't Look Away, Embracing Anti-Bias Classroom book study. I would like to welcome our moderator, Dr. Madeline Chimka, works at the Center for Early Education Research and Evaluation at HighScope, where she currently supports the design, implementation, and evaluation of the U.S. Department of Education Investing in Innovation I3 project. Dr. Chimka completed her EDD in Education Policy and Leadership at Vanderbilt University, where she previously taught for Metro Nashville Public Schools. Her previous research experiences focused on community-based participatory methods, wellness programming, and school leadership.
Thank you, Alejandra. As Alejandra just shared, I support research and evaluation at HighScope, but prior to joining the HighScope team, I spent 7 years in the classroom as an educator. And what makes me personally excited about today's conversation is the overlap I find between my current work in research and my prior experiences as an educator in terms of data, because often as an educator, my data was gathered from and for assessments. As a researcher, I also find myself wrestling with some of the same questions about data that I did as a teacher, such as how can we make data or information gathered from assessments accessible and meaningful? And what is the work that needs to be done, both learning and unlearning, to address bias and racism in assessment practices? Joining me today to unpack and explore these questions is Dr. Figueras-Daniel, who joins us from New Jersey and is the Associate Director of the Strauss Center for Young Children and Families at Bank Street College of Education. Alex began her career as a preschool teacher at a dual immersion school and is the co-author of the Classroom Assessment of Supports for Emergent Bilingual Acquisition, which is designed to measure the quality of language supports for dual language learners in the preschool classroom, and the self-evaluation of supports for emergent bilingual acquisition for teachers and their coaches. Also joining us today is Monica Alonzo, who is an early childhood instructional coach for HighScope's San Antonio Hub of Excellence. Monica is a former special education teacher and is currently completing her doctorate at the University of Texas in Austin, where her research focuses on inclusive early childhood classroom communities. We're also joined by Jana Martella, who is the chair of our board here at HighScope and brings more than 30 years of experience in education, including positions as a teacher, an assistant school administrator, state legislative liaison, and coordinator for federal programs. She is currently a senior advisor at the Education Development Center. Thank you all for taking the time to be with us here today for this important conversation on childhood assessments. Before we begin, I also want to highlight the Q&A feature on this webinar, which is different from the chat feature. The chat feature allows us to share our reactions, thoughts, introduce ourselves. I'm seeing a lot of pop-ups from people from all over. But the Q&A feature will allow us to prioritize questions. We've allocated some of our time today to hear from you and our team members. And our team members will pull questions for our panelists using this feature. Alex, I'd like to begin our conversation today with you to learn more about your experiences with assessment of young children.
Sure. I have been a HighScope teacher and have used CORE in the earliest part of my career. Back when I taught in Elizabeth, New Jersey, I see some folks signing on. And for me, the experience of using a formative assessment was extremely powerful in that it really allowed me not only to assess, what children knew, what they needed to do next, but about myself as a teacher and what sorts of opportunities and ways to engage them would be best. And so I think from that experience, for me, it's extremely important in thinking about equity to really hone our practice on formative assessment and really understanding where children are and what are the opportunities that we need for them to be able to highlight their strengths and to plan on a very individual person-to-person basis.
Mhm. Alex, I heard you mention the word formative for formative assessments. Could you talk more about why you find formative assessment useful and important, not only for practitioners, but also children and their families?
Yes. So from my perspective, formative assessment is the best way to capitalize on what children know. And so I think in translating what children know and how families can support them, this is a very positive way to do it. Everyone wants to hear all of the great things that their children can do. And I think we're at a moment where we need to rely heavily on families to support our processes in schools and programs, to really understand what children are coming to school with, given our current experience and circumstances. I think, again, it allows us to observe what children are doing and really think deeply about maybe experiences and opportunities that we need to create for children to ensure that they're having an equal opportunity to access content and concepts and vocabulary and just building background knowledge.
Yeah, I heard you talk specifically about thinking deeply about capturing what children know, and then also providing opportunities for children to show what they know. Could you talk a little bit more about that, considering that the topic of this is really about measuring what matters?
Yeah, I think, I guess thinking about a curriculum that really allows children to explore and for us to engage what they're interested in, the opportunities to observe children and see what makes them happy, what makes them tick is the best way to really have the chance to see what they know, which is really different than putting them in a situation where there are specific questions that they're answering, and where we have the opportunity to see them as a really whole person and to think about the language that they're using to express themselves, the interactions that they're having. And so it does create a really nice opportunity to see the whole person and for us to think about our own practice and how to work with them.
Thank you, Alex. I now want to shift to Monica, who again is joining us from San Antonio and is an instructional coach for HighScope San Antonio Hub of Excellence. Monica, can you share a little bit about your experience using Core Advantage in your classroom?
Yes, I spent 8 years in the classroom as a early childhood special ed teacher, and it was an inclusive classroom community. So I had the opportunity to work alongside children, their families, additional classroom teachers, and therapists involved in each child's education. So our classroom community still served children with varying abilities. The teachers and I worked in communion with children and their families to get to know each child and each child's identity. So we did home visits, and then I also had the opportunity to work with children in their homes alongside their families. And it was through forming a relationship with each child and their family that allowed us to best meet their needs as a child with a disability, but also to honor their disability. So in the classroom belonged to the children. They had full accessibility to the adults, classroom materials, the school community and their peers. And we used the HighScope curriculum, and instruction was planned and intentional based on observations of children's interest. And also we always centered the child at the core of instruction. And the tool that we used for assessment was Core Advantage. And one of the main forms of data collection for Core Advantage was our anecdotal notes. So I wanted to share a little bit about the anecdotal notes and kind of like what those look like. So they were collected daily by all the teachers in the classroom, and throughout the daily routine, there were 5 adults at the time in the classroom. And our children were at varying developmental stages, and all our children had strengths. And it was through observation, as Alex mentioned, of their play, and also observation of communication. We had some children that communicated with visuals, gestures, sign language, assistive technology, verbally, and also observations of their interactions with peers, adults, their family, their environment, and even the more than human world, that we were able to see those strengths and their interests. So once we had like this rich anecdotal notes daily from our observations and interactions, then we were able to scaffold their own individual learning throughout the daily routine. So as an example, if we had a child that communicated with one word, such as like hungry, to an adult, then when in Core Advantage, we were able to know that they were, for example, at a level 2 and building relationships with adults. Then our role as a teacher was, how can we continue to scaffold the child's learning through support and assistance to fully honor the child's intentions while continuing to support them to continue to flourish. But also, anecdotal notes were not only collected from the teachers, they were also shared through the experiences of families. So that was really important, the teacher and family relationships. So communication was so important, be it through a text message, a written note, a phone call, or even during drop off or pickup. Those moments were just so important to all of us. So parents during those moments would share their children's lived experiences of their child at the home. And then we were able to record like a quick anecdotal note, like mentally. And then we came back in the classroom, let's write it down of what their child was doing in the home. And then all the anecdotal notes were centering at the moment, like each individual child. So when it came to share parents, like the core family report, it's as if parents could picture what their child was doing and saying by a note or a few sentences that were so descriptive, and possibly even a picture if we had captured it. So then when it came together to meet as during conferences or even an IEP meeting, where we come together as an IEP team, the families, anyone else involved, school nurse, administrators, therapists, then you get a full picture of a child and all the amazing capabilities the child has and all the knowledge that they bring into the classroom. So there's this beautiful picture of each individual child. And the best part was, as those moments were shared with families, like parents would keep those family reports as part of their preschool years of where their children were at the moment at 3, 4, and 5 years old.
Thank you so much for sharing, Monica. The concept that you described of this big picture and sharing with families really resonated from a quote from Don't Look Away, which talked about really making sure that families are not only engaged, but supported in the process. I'm wondering if you could talk more about, you talk about different moments such as drop-offs, pickups, and then you also talked about home visits. Could you talk a little bit more about how those moments helped captured what you were trying to measure or how you used Core Advantage?
Yeah, and working alongside families, parents, we all know, are their child's first teacher. So when you have the opportunity of being invited into their home, you get to learn so much about their child, their lived experiences within the home, within the community, elders that live within the home. So we get to hear all these narratives that families and then the elders as well that are sharing about the lives of their children. And you only not to get, the beautiful part is you don't just hear about the child, you get to hear about everyone, the whole family's life. And then and being in the community as well too. But sometimes children may not do some things that they may do in the home, and then they may not do it in the school. So then we get to hear maybe they have this interest for a particular thing, or they have an interest in helping family cook dinner. And in the school, then how can we relate that to the school setting and bring that same that connection within the school setting as well too? Because we want that fluidity to continue to exist between home and school. Home and school is like, there's not this binary, there's this fluidity that should go between language and culture and identities between the home and schools.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm still thinking and reflecting on what you just said about how we often think about school and communities and home as this binary, and how the binary can be not helpful, and how our thinking is extended when we remove that binary. I also wanted to learn more about your experience with this work as an instructional coach. So considering the work that you do to lead and support educators in San Antonio, what does this work look like now that your role has shifted?
Now that it's shifted, the great part is that I still get to work alongside children and families. And that was the hardest part of making the decision to step out of the classroom. So then I get to work alongside teachers, be it teachers that are new in the field or have been in the field for many years. And we always remind each other that be it in the field 1 year, 15 years, we're all continuing to learn, not just from each other, but from the children in our classroom and all the knowledge that they bring and all the knowledge that families bring as well too within communities. So we're here to learn from each other. And I have the opportunity to spend time in classrooms and work with teachers, and then also reflect with them on their teaching practices and work together. And from those teaching practices and reflections, then they get to set their own goals. Then it's more meaningful because they're setting their own goals. And then I'm able to provide support, and they're able to let me know what they need to continue to grow. And we use the HighScope curriculum, and also they're working towards HighScope certification in their classrooms as well too. So I'm able to provide that support. But it's really important that that reflection comes from them and not from someone that's just coming in and telling them like, okay, this is what I observed. But it's more of like, okay, let's take this moment, possibly a recording of the classroom of instruction, and then reflecting on those practices together.
Thank you so much for sharing. It almost feels like, in terms of this reflection process, another form of not necessarily assessment, but more of a way to reflect and strive towards that goal of what you shared at the beginning of us all being learners, regardless of our role.
Yes, and it's always remembering to keep the child and the families at the center. And the goal is always to provide children with access to high quality early childhood education. So that is always our goal, in keeping children and families at the center.
Thank you so much, Monica. I would now like to shift to Jana to hear some of your thoughts on what Alex and Monica have shared about assessments.
Thank you, Madeline. And I also already have questions for Alex and for Monica as well. So I'll save those till the end of my brief discussion. This is a schematic for HighScope, kind of the wheel and the spokes on the wheel, and the wheels going round and round, and it's heading in a direction that we're all aiming for. And I think it paints a really good picture, not only of HighScope, not only of Core Advantage and the tools that are surrounding and supporting the HighScope curriculum and HighScope practice and training, but good practice for young children in general. And so I would like to give a little bit of background. My background in assessment, I come from, as Madeline highlighted, I come from K-12 education. I was a 2nd through 6th grade teacher before becoming an assistant administrator in that elementary school, and then headed off in a policy wonk direction. And my first introduction to early childhood education was in the early aughts, as the federal government and the Federal Department of Education and early childhood programs were really beginning to focus on assessing child outcomes. This was the No Child Left Behind era. In that era, actually, it seems that at that time, fewer than half the states actually had key developmental indicators for children aged 3 and 4, fewer than half. Early childhood guidelines, as we call them, or early childhood standards, to which curricula and assessments might be calibrated. And in fact, I feel if I really hail back to that era, curriculum, assessment, and standards were kind of dirty words in the early childhood world. The childhood experience and their learning should derive from their interests. And so curriculum should be child-centered. Of course, we know research has proven this to be true. At the same time, there were great concerns that the stakes of measuring child outcomes would be borne by the children, which is not something that we necessarily would want to follow. And then regarding standards, we know that children and young children in particular cannot be standardized, right? And so they're the individualized kind of the wheel around these spokes highlights something that is very key and important for early learning and for early childhood development. I'm sure you all are familiar with the expression that hails from the tribe in Africa, the Maasai, when they greet one another. Hopefully you've heard this. If not, it's a very strong component and really drives me. When Maasai tribes people see each other from a next village or on the road, they don't ask, how are you doing? Or, hope you're well, etc. The expression that they use always universally is, how are the children doing? And I think that this is a key component for driving our work and driving assessment practices. All of the measures that have been developed since 2000, before and after, ought to be developed and designed in order to answer that question. How are the children doing? And in fact, the measures that we engage on and engage with ought to assess often and everything within the wheel. So there is child assessment, of course, and but there also should be program assessment, assuring that children are receiving the opportunities and the experiences that are going to help them learn. That the comprehensive system actually does address the multiple domains of learning, and that it also the child and teacher interactions are measured and assessed. Of course, looking at the learning environment and making sure that it measures up as well. And interestingly, learning takes place throughout the day, and observations by the teacher are made throughout the day. And therefore, really, there ought to be some kind of, not uniformity, but intention to measuring the success of those daily routines. One of the things that Don't Look Away really stresses for us is it challenges us to identify disparities and to address biases, for example. And all of these different measures allow us to know where additional supports need to be provided in order to address disparities. And if we're not addressing those disparities, then we won't get at the answer that the Maasai tribe kind of provides us. And the center of the wheel in terms of early learning and early learning outcomes is the response that the children are doing very well. We want to have the tools at our disposal to know if the children are doing very well across multiple dimensions, across all of both the domains of learning. And therefore we engage, in addition to core advantage, children should be screened regularly, especially in the infant and toddler years, for delays, for vision, for health screenings, dental screenings, etc. These are component parts that pull us together into a comprehensive whole so that we can respond. The children are doing very well. Madeline, I don't know if you have some questions for me. I'll stop there because I do have some questions for Alex and for Monica as well.
Thank you, Jana. I really appreciated your comment about having the tools to know if students are doing well. And then given my background in wellness programming for students, I was so excited that you highlighted the importance of health screeners and how it's part of this work. Why don't, if you would like to ask your questions to our panelists, and then we'll move into the Q&A shortly after. Does that sound okay?
Sure, that sounds great. I also do want to address that in the wheel, we don't have to go back to it, Katie, but family engagement is really an important component of the overall framework. And assessment, child assessment in particular, gives the teacher a conduit of communicating with the family, letting them know how their children are doing. And also, you know, forming a partnership with the parents if additional supports are needed to provide those supports, to provide the additional language supports, which leads me to my question for Alex. Alex, I know you have a lot of background and experience on children who are dual language learners. And I think that the assessment tools and assessment in general, I want you to address the thinking that went into the assessment tools that you have helped design and develop, but also you know, purpose and use of wide-scale assessment practices and how we can make sure that those are working for children who are, I'll say for dual language learners in particular. I always say that young children in our world, all of them are English language learners, right? So we don't call them ELLs. They, you know, all of us should be dual language learners as well, because that really is a strength and asset. So Alex, take it away. I'm sure you have plenty to say on this topic.
Yeah, I think that, you know, our initial thinking in developing the measures for at least classroom, thinking about classroom supports, was the real need to zoom in and use a particular focus to see, you know, who needed different kinds of supports, and that there had to be a way to reflect on what was happening in the classroom in order to provide feedback to teachers and to support teachers in supporting children. So that was the main kind of gist behind it. That said, the tools are very particular about thinking in, I would say, through an equity lens, in that they are set up to really have teachers, and particularly the self-reflection tool, to help teachers think about the fact that even dual language learners are very diverse within the group of dual language learners, and that children's proficiency in English varies depending on what are their exposures to English at home. Are they spending lots of time with an older sibling? Are they spending more time with a grandparent? And so the idea was to really help teachers think about the fact that children are on different levels of development in terms of English, you know, English language development. So there has to be a particular attention paid, for example, to the kind of vocabulary words that you're going to introduce or that you're going to highlight during a story reading, and that people are at different levels. At the same time, in thinking about being supportive of home language, the kinds of words and concepts that you would introduce if you have the ability to be using a home language will also vary and be different. So, you know, it's not a parallel, you know, we can't think of English acquisition and the development of a home language as a sort of parallel process, because we have to acknowledge that children who have spent 4 years learning a home language have a need for a different kind of support in order to grow that and to be supportive if we are in fact really embracing an asset-based approach to maintaining home language, which I think we're as much as we can all in agreement about at this time. I guess maybe you might have to restate this. I know there was a second part to the question, and I hopefully I've answered the first one.
I think you've gotten at it. I was addressing the idea of all children learning English, but children who have English, whose home language is not English, is really what I was getting at, and I think you did do that. Thank you, Alex.
You're welcome.
Madeline, I think I'll hand back to you because we have some very in-depth questions, and I'd also keep in mind that you may be able to address some and respond to some of those questions in the Q&A. Remind folks in the audience that they can place questions in the Q&A box and that we'll try to get to them. And also, I encourage especially our practitioners, but particularly around some of the questions related to discipline. I'll ask maybe Alexandra Barraza, please feel free to also address some of these questions as well, even though she just introduced the topic today. So back to you, and I'll have additional comments and questions that I'll try to jump in with.
Thank you, Jana. As Jana just mentioned, we've allocated some time for Q&A so that we may interact with you all and respond to some of your questions inspired by our panelists' experiences. I'd like to start off by touching on this year. So all of us, researchers, teachers, instructional coaches, board members, families, or children, regardless of the role, our role and what brought us here today, we've all spent this past year surviving a pandemic. So Alex, what are your thoughts for educators who are hoping to use data in a way that's meaningful this year, despite all the disruptions and challenges that everyone has faced during the pandemic?
Yeah, I think it's particularly important at this time to use whatever data we have. I think one of the things that I've been thinking about is, how teachers are utilizing data for transitions, for example, whatever information teachers may have on the children who they currently are serving, and how are they communicating and engaging in, a forum or a collaborative relationship with the teacher that the child will have next year, assuming that in many cases there's not a looping process. And to, I think, as much as possible, utilize data that they're getting from families, and to facilitate what families might or might not, consider data. And in my mind, it always comes up that families in lots of ways are really good at documenting what children are doing. We have the ease of technology like phones with cameras, and at least in my personal life, I always acknowledge I am a former teacher, a researcher, but a mom, always sharing all of the cool, fun stuff that children are doing at home. And I often think about, how some of those posts and shares could actually be data for teachers to see that somebody wrote their name or, pretended to read a story. And so in my mind, we have lots of data points out there, and it's a matter of really mapping out some explicit ways to think about it and to be able to engage with families in that way, which to me feels very low stakes and very strength-based. And so that then teachers may have other ways of collecting information that at the moment may be challenging if children are not in person. But I think those are kind of my two big thoughts on it is, sharing of data, within programs or as children transition, and to think about, what families can contribute. And then of course, whatever screeners are required, to really think about them as an added piece and to think about how that can be sort of triangulated between observations, what families give and what teachers are directly observing to create a sort of picture of each child.
Thank you so much, Alex. I was really interested in what you said about data this year, or gathering information for that transition next year. And then also, I think what you shared really highlights not only engaging families in the process, but supporting families in the process about all the things that they might be capturing at home and how it's important for this picture of a whole child. Monica, do you have something to share about what Alex just responded to, or the question in general?
Yeah, as Alex was sharing about other forms of data, be it even through social media, there's so much data that's out there, that recordings that families do of even like TikToks and other things that we haven't seen before, that children are showing just all the amazing things that they know and their capabilities through videos that are posted that their families are sharing as well too. So there's a lot of data that is out there that we can as well share and collaborate in the partnerships with families. Data, I know the data in our preschools of Carroll and Tynan, the data that we were seeing was, a lot of it was artifacts of sharing like photos or videos that they were sharing as when children are learning remotely. Parents share videos of being out in the community, being out at parks, being outdoors, or interactions with siblings. So parents were showing just so the amazing things their children were doing in the home. And it wasn't like your typical, like I'm sending in this paper or this worksheet or something, and where children trace letters, but they were forming letters with sticks and forming letters in the mud, or numbers, or counting ceiling tiles. So it was just different forms of gathering data of as children were doing things in their home and within the community.
Thank you, Monica. I love all of those examples. I am not proficient in TikTok yet. I feel as though I'm going to need to be eventually, but I love all those examples you include of drawing in the mud and different ways of counting. I am going to get to some questions from our audience, but I have one more for you all. In Don't Look Away, the authors are clear about the difference between equality and equity, and that teachers must use an equity approach that considers all children's individualized needs. How might educators apply their experiences with assessments to advocate for equity so that teachers can provide children with what they need to thrive in their classrooms, in their schools, in their communities, and beyond?
So I'll take a whack from one perspective, and I'm eager to hear from everybody across the panel. Folks have been talking about data. At the same time, observation data can be anecdotal. So I would think that finding a way to make sure that our observers are reliable, that they're checking their own biases as they're observing the children. I also would really suggest that that teachers think about aggregating and disaggregating the data that they're collecting about their classroom. And when the classroom, whatever the tools and measures that they use, is aggregated for the classroom for the teacher's purposes, they may find where some of their instructional where instructional supports are needed so that they can strengthen their supports for particular children if they are, their home language is not English. There may be data that they can use, and often aggregated classroom information is going to provide information to the teacher for where they need to head back to the books or to their coach or to their colleagues for supports. There are some questions in the Q&A that I hope you'll get to, Madeline, around the idea of discipline and more child performance in terms of assessment, but also related to behavior and adult-child interactions around conflict resolutions, encouragement, the way that teachers converse with children can sometimes be wrapped in the biases that the teacher brings to the moment. And so I think self-reflection is really an important mechanism for assuring both equity and equal distribution of kind of supports to children. I think your question, you might want to repeat it for the others. I'm sure that others have something to say about that.
Yeah, Jenny, your response made me think of a question that I pulled from someone about writing notes and taking observations. So I kind of wanted to step back and reflect on something you said in terms of the person asked, how do we ensure that anecdotal notes are written objectively, keeping awareness of personal implicit bias while writing these observations?
Yeah, I would like to pose that to our practitioners in particular, and Madeline as a researcher and Alex as a researcher, you might have some advice to offer as well. And Alejandra, Dr. Barraza, also you may have some advice about how how teachers in San Antonio, for example, make sure that their practice is calibrated with one another.
A lot of the teachers in our schools, it really requires a great relationship between the teacher and the assistant, and really to be really thoughtful of looking at the whole child. And that was something that was very important for us in our school, in our school. And we think about assessments just a lot of times as one standardized measure. But when you have the opportunity to take anecdotal notes, to have observations, to use an assessment tool like CORE, it really helps us, it pushes us as educators to view the strengths of the child. And I think that's what was so powerful in us using that. We started using learning stories also, which is a qualitative assessment that is used in New Zealand. And we started implementing that that in our schools many years ago. And what we learned from that is the power of how it improved our relationships with parents. Because a lot of times when we meet with parents to give them results on assessments, when it's a standardized assessment, you tell them, your child can read 4 letters or your child couldn't read the 10 letters that they're expected to read. And a lot of times that's disappointing to parents. But when you give them observations, when you give them anecdotal notes of the child, it really brings on a more of a look of resilient for the child. So it's a positive outlook on the child. The parent understands that the teacher is really wanting to understand more in depth about their children versus just measuring them against a number. So as an early childhood team and group, and all of our participants that are on board with us, it's very important that we continue to speak up with our voice about why it is so important to look at the children as the whole child and not necessarily as a standardized measure. when we think about data, it's not only within within one standardized tool that is given to all children. It isn't. We need to continue pushing and saying there are so many ways to look and measure a child.
Monica or Alex, do you have something you'd like to share? I saw both mics turn on. So Monica, do you want to share first and then we'll move to Alex?
Yes, as Dr. Barraza was sharing about the learning stories and also to advocate, at times we don't have a choice in the assessment that we can use within our role as a teacher, because it's mandated that we use a certain assessment that we may not agree upon, that we know it's not what's best for children, and that it's not high quality, and it's just showing a number, and it's showing a child that's marked in red, and that's what you're supposed to share with parents. But then we also have this other opportunity to take some rich data and tell like a different narrative of each individual child within our classroom, and to show all the amazing capabilities that children have, even as something as child spills water on the floor, and that interaction is not stopped by the teacher saying like, what are you doing? Or they can clean it up, but then they go and grab paper towels, and then other children join in and they grab a mop, and then it becomes this whole communal beautiful moment that children are helping each other clean up spilled water, and the teacher did not stop it, and she allowed for this opportunity to occur in the classroom. And then this beautiful learning story is written about it, and a picture is captured, and then it's shared with the family that this moment happened. And it's very powerful. And then the child as well too, when you write the learning story, then it's part of the classroom as well too, the classroom library of books. And then children can continue to read their own learning stories, share them with their friends, and then you continue to build upon these learning stories. And then families can also have the opportunity to add to their learning stories, to add an extension to them as well too. And then the learning stories, I know in New Zealand, they continue past the preschool years, and it continues up to the high school years. So then you have like these beautiful books of learning stories from when they were 3 to all the way when they were in high school. Which, I don't know, for me, that's more important than a number of how many letters I knew when I was in pre-K. But that's just the important, as a teacher, like the opportunities that we have to show like a different narrative of each individual child within our classroom.
Thank you, Monica.
I was just going to add that going along with some of the themes from the book and what you've already said is, I think one of the things that I'm realizing is if we think about assessment and telling stories about children and the obvious need to check our bias and to really focus on strengths, kind of like two things come to mind. One is, and I do believe it takes practice as a researcher. I know it takes lots of practice to train people to be observers, you know, and I don't think anyone can ever really be fully objective. But the idea that, you know, as a teacher and as someone who's building a community with families, that, you know, I guess, and they do talk about this in the book, establishing a community where maybe maybe there is some public sharing of the stories and the narratives that are happening in the classroom. And that maybe if we are more comfortable with kind of putting this information out for parents and classroom visitors, that it does push us and encourage us as teachers to focus on strengths and to really build a positive community. And that it doesn't, you know, and I think this is in some ways where maybe the current circumstances can open opportunities for us to view lots of our educational practices in new ways, but to really think about, you know, what are the anecdotes that we're writing, you know, what's our position within the story? Is it something that we're willing to share on a wall with families and not scores here, but, you know, I think there are opportunities, particularly in early childhood, for us to use narrative to document process and progress, and just fun stories. And I think in some ways, if we look at it that way, or even maybe not, maybe if we can't get to that kind of like more public show, think about how we can establish learning communities within the teachers who are working together in a building to look at evidence and look at anecdotes and really think about ways in which we can check our bias or improve our focus on what are children doing versus what they're not doing. And I think added to that, I love what you said about collaborating with assistant teachers. In some of my research, assistant teachers do figure very prominently. And thinking about what can assistant teachers contribute to very positive assessments of children, particularly if they may be the person who can use the home language to understand what children know. And we know from research that may be the sort of landscape of the classrooms, is that the assistant teacher may be the person who is doing more communicating with families because they have the home language. So I think that, to me, and thinking about equity and really careful anecdotes, when we can document what children are doing in their home language, we should, because that may really highlight what children know, again, rather than focusing on what they don't know.
Making learning visible, I think, is what we're all after. And in fact, children can be engaged in that process as well, right?
Thank you, Alex. I really appreciated how you talked about, I know my first question was a big one about the pandemic, but I love that Monica, you use the word opportunity, and Alex, you really highlight ways that we can actually be innovative. So to use this experience to push ourselves forward and find ways to be innovative and serve our families and our students. In capturing this narrative that we've described, or this picture of a whole child, one person posed the question, what happens when the child is stubborn or uncooperative and refuses to participate in classwork or maybe a process in the classroom? Monica, I know you had a beautiful story about the paper towel, but what happens when that doesn't happen naturally?
As a teacher, it takes maybe the opportunity to step back and see how the child's interacting with the moment that is occurring. Perhaps they're an observer and they're just taking in the moment and they're not yet ready to take the step into the activity, and they're listening. And I found that quite often when I was in the classroom and with children with varying abilities, they weren't just yet ready to join in the dance movements, but sometimes they just got closer to the carpet one day. And it was in that observation where maybe when they started, they were across the room. And then as time progressed, they got closer and closer to those activities of music and movement and using musical instruments, or that small group activity. Or as an example, I was playing with children in a classroom today, and there was a little one that was not yet ready to join in the large group, and they were throwing letters up in the air and they were flying. So we threw up letters in the air in another area as it was occurring. So we still participated together. We were just not within that same space as the other group of children, but we were in our own space and throwing letters and catching them, and then they would all fall down. And then I was commenting on the language or on the letters that were falling down on him. So as we still continued with the lesson, but he was not yet ready to join the whole group, but we still had our own moments on the side.
Thank you, Monica. Other thoughts on that question? Alex, Jana, Alejandra?
I mean, it always requires, and Monica tells these stories. I got to observe her as an administrator, and just the amount of the part where the child does not want to participate is part of their growth. So, we always try to force children at times into certain activities, but you know, in my observation of Monica, she would sometimes spend 30 minutes in calming down the child. And that's also the way that she was scaffolding the way that he was learning how to self-regulate at that time. And so it's just giving the child the opportunity to have those moments and acknowledging that it is part of their growth. I do want to connect because I know there were a lot of questions, which makes us understand that we need to continue this conversation. But one of the things about our assessment at HighScope that it is that our core looks at the whole child. It looks at in their natural setting, in really giving the opportunity of throughout the day, throughout the year. And that's what's so important about an assessment. And shouldn't that be the way that we assess everyone? I mean, all the way up to college. So just a way of thinking when we're thinking about anti-bias classrooms and when we're thinking about why assessments are so important when we are trying to define children and the impact that standardization can have on children is something that we all need to, as educators, really continue to consider.
Thank you, Ali. Dr. Barasa, in the chat, actually, there was a very articulate response that if a child fails to respond to our planning, then we haven't planned for that child. And that gets at the individualized around the wheel and addresses what you were just speaking of as well.
Monica and Alex, we're close to closing time, so I just want to see if you had a response that you wanted to share. All right, we're moving into closing time as it's already 3 o'clock, approaching 3 o'clock. I don't know how that happened, but we have 4 minutes left. So I do want to hand it off to Jana to close us out. And I really want to thank Alex and Monica for joining us today to share about their experiences and all the stories that they've shared with us today. Thank you so much for being here for this important conversation.
Yes, definitely. And thank you, Madeline, for your very able moderation and also for the expertise that you brought to this. I think Katie has some closing slides for us that I want to address. A number of you have asked about certificate of attendance. Yes, if you attended the webinar, and HighScope is making arrangements. If you found this useful, please pass the recording along to your colleagues, and they also, if requested, can receive a certificate of attendance for watching the webinar. Our next session, we have 2 more, and we will be honing in on the workforce on March 31st at this same time. I think somewhere in the middle, we are going from standard time to daylight saving. So monitor your clocks. It will be 2 o'clock Eastern, wherever that is around the world for you, and whatever time frame we're in at the moment. That's March 31st. Focus in on the workforce, and we have some great panelists for you there as well. I also want to highlight another professional learning opportunity that's coming up really quickly. Put it on your calendars for May 12th through 14th. This is the first year where the HighScope International Conference will be offered during the pandemic on a virtual platform. So the high caliber kind of sessions that you've been engaged with in HighScope are going to be very intensively provided during with multiple experts during those days, May 12th through 14th. I don't think that registration has opened as yet, but stay tuned to the website, put it on your calendars and get ready. It's a great, I have attended in person the last number of years. I am sorry that we won't be seeing people face to face. I love seeing the kids there with their masks and the teacher. So we'll be face to face without masks in this virtual environment. And then lastly, from this series, we want to drive you to the HighScope website and also remind folks that HighScope is a not-for-profit organization. So we provide lots of opportunities. We're celebrating, because of the pandemic, kind of the 50th year of HighScope over multiple years. So please consider giving, investing in HighScope. They invest in our children and invest in research for supporting all of our children